Donald Rumsfeld is here. He is both the youngest and the oldest person to have served as Secretary of Defense. He has also been a Navy fighter pilot, a congressman, and the CEO of 2 Fortune 500 companies. His new book is called Rumsfeld's Rules, Leadership Lessons in Business, Politics, War, and Life. Part memoir, part management guide. It offers an insight into Donald Rumsfeld's collection of people with advice. Good rules, he says. We have talked many times to him about his conduct as Secretary of Defense and his involvement in several Republican administrations. This conversation is about Donald Rumsfeld's book and what he has learned from the rules of other people. I'm pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you, sir.
All right, we're going to talk primarily about what's in this book and what we can learn from what you learned about how to be able to manage things, how to be able to lead. So how did this come about?
It came about because I was asked to come back as Gerald Ford's chief of staff in the White House. And my mother had been a school teacher.
Right after he succeeded.
Exactly. Only president never elected president or vice president to succeed a president who resigned, the only one in history, and we hope the last and only one. But I said something in the Oval Office one day, and he said, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, it's one of these rules that I write down. When I make a mistake, I write a little note so that I won't make it again." And my mother was a school teacher, and I started keeping 3x5 cards, and have done it to this day. And he said, "Well, let me see the rules." And I said, "Okay." So I had them typed up, and he labeled them Rumsfeld's Rules. Yeah. And they got a life of their own. The Wall Street Journal wrote an article, Alan Otten did, and then the New York Times did.
Didn't John McWethy write something about it one time?
Oh, yes, later, much later.
Later,
yes, indeed. Yeah.
It was the first time I knew about Rumsfeld Rules.
Yeah, and people have asked for copies, and so I decided to write a book about them. And, of course, they're not my rules. They're from people a lot smarter than I am, Sun Tzu and Winston Churchill. And
your father.
And my dad, that's right, and my wife's dad. Yeah. My wife's dad said to me, "Look, Don, if you're coasting, you're going downhill." Now, that's worth remembering.
Or looking back rather than looking forward.
The other thing he said to me one day, he said, "Don, always have 6 months' salary in the bank. And then if some boss tells you to do something you think is wrong or illegal or immoral or you just don't agree with, you can tell them to go to the Dickens.
Right.
And you don't have to do it."
Good advice. Yeah. Now, tell me what your father taught you.
My father was head of the ethics committee for the North Shore Real Estate Board outside of Chicago. He sold houses. And I watched him and listened to him day after day, and he was just a wonderful, wonderful man and so honorable. And then I went off to college, and the political science professors said how business people were corrupt and immoral and greedy and bad. That's kind of what they taught in colleges back in those days, and I suppose still today. And I knew it wasn't so, because I knew my father was an honorable man. And if he taught me to read, for one thing. So did my mom. But
to read and be curious.
Yeah, exactly. And he was a voracious reader, and he used to tease me because I seemed to always have a book. He called me Spitzweg, the bookworm.
But what did he tell you about quitting?
Oh, that was so funny. I wrote him a note during World War II. He was out in an aircraft carrier in the Pacific, and I said, "Dad, I've been in the Boy Scout for several years, and I think I'm going to drop out of the Boy Scouts and spend more time playing sports with my friends." And he wrote back and said, "That's fine, Don. You go ahead and quit the Boy Scouts, and then next month you can quit something else, and then you can quit something else. Pretty soon you'll be a darn good quitter." Yeah. I never quit. I went right on and got Eagle Scout.
Now, there are, 360 rules in here?
And the last one is, if you have rules, never have more than 10.
10, and we have 360.
That's
right.
So
you break your own rules.
I do. Yeah. Of course. My goodness, that's how you learn, is to do things in life and then write down something to avoid doing that. I suppose one of my rules is if you're going to make mistakes, make original mistakes. Don't make ones you've made before.
Now, this looks like predetermined by me, but it's not. I just opened the book to this one. Don't over-control like a novice pilot. Stay loose enough from the flow that you can observe and calibrate. Hello?
Yeah.
Hello?
That's important.
Yeah.
I was a flight instructor, and I watched some flight instructors and with students, and the students would often over control. Yeah. And if you're a manager, you have to have multiple leadership centers. And that's the only way you can run a big organization. And if you try to micromanage it, kind of like President Jimmy Carter did, it doesn't work. It works better if you do like Ronald Reagan did and be more strategic and kind of...
But don't you have a bit of control in you?
No.
Not at the Pentagon? Not in any of the jobs you've had?
No. I'm a big delegator of big chunks of authority. You have to be. You just have to do that.
Which one have you lived by that served you the best? Or two?
Well,
or
yeah,
three?
if in doubt, don't.
Yeah.
And if still in doubt, do what's right.
Okay, I agree with that. But at the same time, there's this rule. You will regret what you didn't do rather than what you did in the end.
Well, yeah, I mean, the road not taken was always smoother.
Yeah.
So that's...
Robert Frost.
Was it Robert Frost?
Yeah,
I credit it to Duncan Hunter,
well, but
a former
the
congressman.
person who actually wrote it was...
Is that right?
Road Not Taken.
I'll have to do a better job of researching before I write my third book.
Or let me see it before you write it. Do you have any women rules in here?
Sure. Mrs. Thatcher's in there.
What did she say?
She said the trouble with socialism is pretty soon you run out of other people's money, which I kind of liked.
Tell me about some of the other rules that, I mean, for example, that you talk about that have influenced your life.
Well, I think one of the most important in the business world, we say what you measure improves.
See, that's great.
And it's true. You need metrics, and you need to decide what's important, what's worth measuring in the first place. That means these things aren't going to be measured, but that is. And it gets better. In the military, they say the same thing. They say you get what you inspect, not what you expect.
Bill Gates, in his letter to stockholders of the Gates Foundation, or the people who contribute to that, letter to stockholders based on the kind of thing that Warren Buffett's been doing for years, talks about measurement in philanthropy, how important it is so that you can be convinced that what you are doing, you have a way to measure progress and results and to test people for performance.
And the greatest risk of people not measuring and not knowing progress, not having metrics, is in nonprofits and government.
Right.
Because in business, you fail. You go out of business. If you do it badly and you don't measure and you don't get better and you don't improve and you're not competitive, you go out of business. The philanthropy can go on and on and on because they have endowment and they spend the endowment. The business doesn't. In government, it's always other people's money you're using. And people treat other people's money differently than they treat their own. It's just an inevitable. It breaks my heart when I see it in government.
It's the old notion nobody ever washes a taxi or a rental car.
There you go.
I think Larry Summers first said that.
Yeah.
What are you proudest of in terms of this 81 years you've been alive?
I suppose marrying Joyce.
Well, of course it is. And to know Joyce is to appreciate it. No, to know her is to be appreciative of that fact.
I mean, just talk of what did I know at 22 years old?
And I just asked you tonight about what you were doing here in New York, and you said you were staying at a certain hotel. And I said, why are you staying there? And you said, because Joyce likes it.
That's right.
You know, which shows a real sense of...
Well, she's a special lady.
She really is. So that's one. But what in your public life?
I think serving.
Okay, but you've served in various capacities, you know?
Well, the hardest job I ever had was being chief of staff of the White House for Gerald Ford. And
because he had such a difficult transition to make.
Gosh, yeah. The war in Vietnam was ending in an ugly way, and the economy was in the tank, and the credibility of the government was down just as low as it could be, and he'd never served in an executive position, and he was one of the finest human beings on the face of the earth.
You know what Gerald Ford did? I mean, you obviously know this. He put together a really wonderful group of people.
Oh, he did.
So when you went to Washington, you were the mentor for Dick Cheney. He was the protege of Donald Rumsfeld. Would you grant me that?
I hired him in 1969 as a special assistant.
Right.
And
then when you were at the White House as chief of staff, you brought him in as deputy chief of staff?
No, I brought him in as an assistant. And then when
you left?
I recommended him to President Ford to succeed me as chief of staff, and he did. And he's a friend to this day. He's one of those people that never asked for anything, never tried to do anything special. He just put his head down. Whatever he was asked to do, he did it. And then he'd do things he wasn't asked to do.
But is there a senior person to this relationship? Because in the last time you were in government service, you were Secretary of Defense, and he was Vice President.
Sure. We're close friends.
Okay, but how does that work? I mean, it's not an issue at all.
No.
Who's in a higher rank in terms of public jobs?
No, I've got enormous respect.
The same sense of the relationship is there.
You bet. And he's writing a book now about heart transplants, of all things, with his doctor, which ought to be an interesting one.
This is from Lewis Carroll. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. See, that's great. You know, I mean,
it's true.
It really is.
And in life, that's easy to happen because sometimes you can want to do so many things. The other one in there that I think maybe is the one I mentioned to Gerald Ford when he said get those written down was, if you're working off your inbox, you're working off other people's priorities. Exactly, and the goal, if you're a leader, is to have people working off your outbox.
I tell you this. I mean, you read through these things, there's a lot of wisdom here. And it is the wisdom of a lot of people. George Marshall, if you get the objective right, a lieutenant can write the strategy.
Yes. Yeah, that is the hard thing. And Eisenhower said something similar. He said, well, it's not quite similar, but it's of a kind. He said, the plan is nothing. Planning is everything. Why did he say that? He said it because in competition, whether it's in war or business, first contact with the enemy and the plan's out because the enemy has a brain. The enemy's going to do things, and you have to adapt to that.
If you don't know what your top 3 priorities are, you don't have priorities.
That's right. If you walk around the corner and some guy's coming at you, works with you, what are your top 3 priorities? If he stumbles, doesn't answer, he doesn't have them. He doesn't know where he's going. Any road will get him there.
You have also said that when you go into a meeting, know what you want to get accomplished.
Exactly.
You know,
there's a chapter on how to run a meeting.
I know. That's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, and it's the first thing about running a meeting is deciding whether you really need one. Or whether you could do something with a memo.
With your time. Oh, memo, right. Tell me where this comes from. He who defends everywhere defends nowhere.
Is that Sun Tzu?
Yes.
Yes, it sounds like Sun Tzu.
I mean, these are really good. I mean, this is a lot of wisdom here in terms of what... Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see.
That is Schopenhauer. And Gretzky said something similar about hockey pucks.
Right. You know what he said?
What?
What he said was, I look where the puck is going, not where it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
These are really, I mean...
Well, they're fun. I've enjoyed collecting them over the decades, and I've been asked for copies of Rumsfeld's rules so many times. And now I thought, well, I'll talk a little bit about some of those rules and put them in a book form, and fortunately, people are interested, which is fun.
You believe in this one? Not all negative press is unearned. If you're getting it, see if there's a reason.
Exactly. My wife has one on the press in there.
What does it say?
She said, avoid infatuation with or resentment of the press. They have their job, and you have yours. It's kind of a nice thought.
It's true. You know what the press's responsibility is. Yeah. Exactly right. This is one of my favorite people in the world, the late John Wooden, a coach at UCLA. Discipline yourself, and others won't need to.
Isn't that nice? It's true. Yeah. You need an inner gyroscope in life. I like the one you haven't mentioned, and that's
there's a stand-up desk. You believe in stand-up desk because it's energizing.
I didn't know it was healthy when I started doing it in 1969. I just started doing it, and I liked it, and it keeps meetings a little shorter if you're standing up. Some people like to get too comfortable.
Exactly. This is one I believe in too. This has to do with a lot of things having to do with relationships. If you expect people to be in on the landing, include them for the takeoff.
Exactly.
You know, bring them in at the beginning.
Yep.
And then they'll stay there for the landing.
Exactly.
Right? Men count up the faults of those who keep them waiting. French proverb.
Exactly.
Men count up the faults of those who keep them waiting. Yeah.
Just to be inclusive there.
Encourage others to give their views, even if it may ruffle some feathers. That's always true.
But it is important in a meeting to look around the room, and if you see someone who you think may disagree but doesn't want to say it, it's important that they get it out and talk about it.
We were talking about Charles de Gaulle's memoirs earlier.
Yes.
And He said, the cemeteries of the world are full of indispensable men.
That's important to remember. I mean, you get in those jobs, the pressure cooker jobs, and you begin to think it's you that's important as opposed to the responsibilities you have that's important. And there really aren't any indispensable men or women.
Dean Acheson, at the top, there are no easy choices. All are between evils, the consequences of which are hard to judge.
His memoir also
is
another
great.
very
We were talking
good
about great memoir.
Yes, indeed, along with Ulysses Grant's.
Present at the creation.
Exactly.
Clausewitz. Many intelligence reports in war are contradictory, even more are false, and most are uncertain. You might have remembered that.
Indeed. And Mike Hayden, General Hayden had one about it. He said, if it's intelligence, it's not a fact. Think of that.
Yeah.
That is exactly right. Otherwise, it wouldn't be intelligence. If it were a fact, it'd be a fact.
Are you continuing to write these things down?
I do.
You're not stopping just because you have
No,
a
I'm
book?
not stopping. I keep adding. I have my file, and I keep adding rules to it, and I hope someday you'll send me a couple of yours because you've been around quite a bit around the track.
A bit. Rumsfeld Rules, Leadership Lessons in Business, Politics, War, and Life. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to see you again. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.